We collected some questions. If any of you still have one of these cards and a pen, if you can get a question down, work it up here. We'll try to work it in. We will take some questions from the floor. We don't have a mic, unfortunately. You'll have to speak up. I'll retranslate the question if necessary. We will start on the left, go to the right, and we will begin with the extremely well-known and esteemed Dr. Bruce Maccabee.
December 8th, 1950, the Counterintelligence Corps was put on immediate high alert for any information related to flying saucers. That comes from a document that was in the FBI file, not discovered until I got the FBI file in May of 1977. So we have the national alert, which is documented in the writings of Truman, the autobiography of Dean Acheson, and White House notes made during a meeting that Acheson had with a Prime Minister of England. Those were all related to the morning of December 6, 1950. And then we have a conjecture based on the testimony of one Robert Willingham, retired Air Force colonel, who in 1966 or 67, was mentioned in a newspaper in Pennsylvania. A newspaper in Pennsylvania which said that he had seen a flying saucer that crashed just over the border of Mexico. And that was investigated mostly by a man that I will be talking about somewhat, one Todd Zeckel, who got Willingham to write a affidavit that has been published widely in the last 20 years or so, 30 years. And this is three things now which may be related together that amount to a mystery of December 6, 1950. So that's the title of my paper, The Mystery of December 6, 1950.
Dr. Michael Sell.
In a couple of minutes, what I think I can do is maybe reflect on why it's important to try to understand how personnel involved in these Majestic 12 programs, covert retrieval, crash retrieval operations, understanding those personnel management issues help us in the big picture, which is to try to promote disclosure. I think the more we're aware of the mechanisms that are used and the way in which personnel are managed, the easier it'll be for us to analyse and to understand the importance of various testimonies that emerge by people who come forward, who have worked in the military or worked in the intelligence community, who say they have something to share. That's very important. Not always do we have the luxury of them being able to document their military background. Some of these people remain in the background. They remain anonymous. They won't even tell you their real name because they're so frightened about coming forward. So how do you analyse testimonies? I mean, I used two people, Clifford Stone, Dan Sherman, whose military records can be substantiated. They did serve for 20 plus years or 12 years. Many of the things that they claimed couldn't be substantiated. In the case of Dan Sherman, he worked in classified projects involving electronic intelligence, so we could substantiate his testimony. But what about people who come, they approach us, researchers, and say, well, I've got some really important things to share with you, but I'm not going to tell you my name. I don't want to tell you the agency I work for because I'm frightened. I'm frightened that if they find out, then I'm going to be in great trouble and my family threatened and so forth. And so we need some way of being able to analyse these testimonies and not just throw them away because it's say, well, this is just unsubstantiated conjecture because we cannot know whether this person is telling us the truth. They don't tell us their name, they don't tell us the agency they work with, we don't have documentation verifying this, we can't analyse the documentation they provide. So we need to develop methodologies for doing all this work, and that's really what I'm involved in doing with this exopolitics research, and I think what you saw today was helping lay the foundations for developing coherent analytical frameworks for assessing whistleblower testimonies with varying degrees of support. Thank you.
So this next gentleman is easily the hippest and coolest of the UFO researchers by far. From the UK, he is to ufology with his very well-known earring what Ed Bradley, the great journalist, was to journalism, in my opinion.
We're all obviously fully aware of the crash retrieval scenario of UFOs crashing, alien bodies being recovered. One area that seldom gets discussed, to any great degree at least until now, is something that has been reported in various documents and from whistleblower sources, that being the scenario of lethal alien viruses being found at crash sites. That's to say, if, for example, an alien body is thrown out of a crashed UFO, the body's torn apart, potentially some sort of lethal virus is exposed to the elements. And according to a number of stories, some of the technicians and recovery units involved have suffered adversely, even fatally, in the vicinity of a number of crashed UFOs. And that may be one of the reasons why there's been such tremendous secrecy surrounding the subject, that potentially the government or the military or the intelligence world has been trying to back-engineer a lethal virus for its own purposes, if you like. Potentially, we might be on the verge of seeing one of the key reasons why there's been such a cover-up of this particular material over the course of the last half a century.
Thank you, Nick. That's a great introduction for what I wanted to say. About 10 years ago, I was involved in the Special Operations Manual trying to authenticate that, and it seemed like it was time to move into some different direction. Now, all civilizations fear epidemics. There's nothing more important than preventing epidemics. And in fact, for those countries that have sent men in space, you know that the first thing to do is quarantine the astronauts to make sure that they're not bringing back some alien virus. And so the question is, have we had this problem already, perhaps associated with crash retrievals? 4 cases where it would appear, and one of those cases is actually in the question documents that I've been studying, would appear that we have been exposed to alien viruses, and from there we'll look and see what other countries around the world do, what kind of laboratories they have, what worries they have, what policies governments have with respect to this subject, and we'll have a little bit of virology 101 for those of you who are not medical students. And then finally, I want to talk about the animal mutilations that Linda Howe has so beautifully brought to the forefront, and speculate as to who's doing that and why, along the lines of Stan's question, why?
Thank you. In case you didn't know, that was Dr. Bob Wood. This is Ryan Wood.
Thank you, Steve. Nye County, Nevada, August 5th, 1949. A miner was sitting there agitating the alkali, as the newspaper article described, when a flying saucer 24 feet in diameter whizzed over his head and crashed in the rocks in front of him. 2 little ETs popped out, ran across the desert, collapsed and died. He grabbed some parts. He went immediately to the newspaper in Los Angeles, where they looked at the parts, and they ultimately wrote a newspaper article about it. And then the disinformation and manipulation started to happen in the next couple days. The Air Force made statements, the cover-ups began, and for that time, there was considerable obfuscation of the true evidence. The names of the persons keeps changing, and so forth. The next phase of the investigation is, I believe I've found the right site. I'm 70% confident I found the right site. And I've been to the site 3 times, and I'm trying to recover extraterrestrial debris. I can neither confirm nor deny the possession of extraterrestrial technology. So that is the 1 minute and 35-second summary.
I have this image in my mind of a year or 2 from now of Ryan Wood sitting in his home office at 99 crashes going, oh, if I could just get one more crash, and boom, something right in his backyard. This next gentleman is a legend. He has received many awards, including the Paradigm Research Group Lifetime Achievement Award in 2005. He needs no introduction. Stanton Friedman.
Thanks. One thing I would be cautious about when it comes to whistleblowers or other witnesses, while we may not be able to get classified documents, as I said, I'm not on anybody's list for distribution of these things, still, we should be able to determine the legitimacy of the person. In other words, if a guy says he went to a certain college, we should be able to find out if he did. And I would stress that, I know this comes as a shock to you, but there are people who lie. I mean, you know, that's hard to believe, but there are people who lie. there is a difference between accepting a story when you really don't expect to get the classified documents and believing that because there may be a grain of truth in the story and that the guy can't provide evidence to back it up, that therefore it's legitimate because the government kept him from providing that evidence. You'd be surprised how many college registrars I've talked to. I call because I'm suspicious about somebody. Did he attend there? Turns out no. And I then ask, do you get a lot of calls about people who claim to have gone there and didn't? All the time was a response I got from one school. Quick story from the Air Force Academy. Prestigious school. I go through this routine. The guy was calling about didn't go there, and yeah, all the time because they're prestigious. She said the worst example was a woman calls me and says her fiancé had lost his diploma, and she wondered if there was a way she could replace it. She thought it would make a nice gift. And she said, the woman on the other end said, sure, give me the data and we'll see what we can do. Turned out he had never gone there. And I wonder about the rest of that story. So I am going to learn some new things. I'm very interested in these new stories and whether they'll prove out or not. But one more thing I do want to add, and that on Bruce's story, that one of the MJ-12 documents, one of the ones I think is legitimate as opposed to the ones I don't think are legitimate, does mention something about, which one did they talk about? El Indio Guerrero, but there's Del Rio too, and I'm mixing the two together. Anyway, I'm not saying that this substantiates or not, but Bruce has got a good story there. I've read the paper.
Thank you, Sam. And now, probably the most talented, multi-talented person in all of extraterrestrial phenomena research. She's done it all the areas. She's got it all covered. My envy knows no bounds. Of course, Linda Moulton Howe.
Thank you. 27 years ago, I started out as a complete and total innocent trying to find out why animals were being found dead with bloodless excisions and no tracks around them, and sat and listened to law enforcement tell me in quiet offices, off the record, never in front of a camera, about all of the beams of light or the discs or what they called creatures from outer space that they were privately convinced was the answer to animal mutilations, but that publicly the only politically acceptable explanation was either satanic cults, disease, or predator. And I stand here now 27 years later, and only 3 weeks ago a sheriff in Montana called me, said, Linda, we've got forensic evidence that an animal has been dropped from the sky, and we have a field in which there are contradictory directions in plants underneath the animal, the direction of the bounce, and we need your help. It took 27 years. And more law enforcement are reaching out because they know that they're not dealing with predator or disease or satanic cults. And the reason I'm saying that as a preface, in the last 3 to 4 years, I've really been beaten up a lot by some of the people at this table, a lot of you out there, and beyond. For what? Because going out into the field and trying to collect physical forensic evidence without a bias is where I started. It was only 10 years ago that Philip J. Corso, who I personally respect very, very much, I do not think that he was a liar. I do not think he was a plant. And when Philip J. Corso told me eye to eye 4 months before he died in a private trip to Florida that he asked me to make, And I don't believe I've ever said to anybody that I made this trip until now, except for a few individually. And he said, Linda, in General Trudeau's office, I was looking at documents about the unusual deaths of animals around this planet in both hemispheres with dates as early as 1951, and it said the perpetrators were extraterrestrial biological entities. How did you get so much classified information? He asked me. And I said, sir, the only thing that I have ever done and the only thing I truly respect is you have to go out into this world. You cannot sit behind a computer or a television screen and throw mud and rocks at people who do try to go out into the field and who do try, honestly, to report what is there, not the political bias of whatever the existing groups are. This is really a prelude to what I'm going to present on Sunday, because I'm sure that a lot of you in this room will come and they will listen, and the next thing I'll hear is, well, where is her proof? And I guess the passion and the energy that you are hearing from me is 27 years ago, I had people say to me, extraterrestrials? Tonight, I bow to Stanton in a way. I respect you immensely. But if I may, I want to use an example of what I personally think is beginning to destroy this field and any possibility of the New York Times ever listening. And that is the Kinross F-89 Lake Superior story that some of you may have heard my report on Coast to Coast in September. I talked with Adam Jimenez for a very long time, and I talked with his colleague, Jim Bassett. Linda Howe was not on that trip in 2005, and neither was Stanton, and neither was James Carrion, and nobody from MUFON, nobody. To the best of my knowledge as an investigative reporter, there has been not one piece of what I would consider to be proof that it's a hoax. And when the word hoax is used, whether it's on the inside group like us or to the outside, to me it makes the government's job easier when the only thing that's been established were the photographs, the website. I did a long interview on Coast which proves nothing, except that this man was able to talk in an interview for an hour with great detail. And after 3 days, they disappear, the website is gone. James Carrion cannot find a paper trail in the Michigan Secretary of State's office of a company. And to the best of my knowledge, unless James has another detail, I don't know anybody who has proved or disproved that they were not in discussion with somebody in the Canadian government. And there is an Occam's razor possibility that they got scared off, as I have had several people scared off this year from talking to me. I think it is important, vital, that we share material that we cannot always prove. And the bottom line is, 10 years ago was the first time that somebody, which was a New Mexico representative, Andrew Kistner, told me that there was a secret war, we were attacking, and there was retaliation. I did not start reporting about it until a year ago. And in this last year, I have put out appeals to military and intelligence people who have firsthand information to contact me. I have now over 200, what I think are pretty substantive contacts, of which I have only been able to report about a dozen. But the one thing I would like to leave in the context of this, and why I feel so much energy, is that I hear as if it is politically the thing to do. Attack first. It's got to be a hoax. It cannot be proved. And if we did that every step of the way, we would never learn anything, because that is exactly the way the government has set the game up. And there are people out there, they are frustrated and they are scared. And I've certainly seen a lot of people scared this year. But they want this story, this fact, that another intelligence, maybe 3 or 7 or 12, are interacting with this planet, have been for a long time, and they are doing animal mutilations. They have done human abductions, and there has been retaliation of the most extraordinary kind. I urge everybody to keep an open mind, and that those of us who are trying to bring information, we can't be so afraid of each other. We can't be so afraid of judgment and somebody saying, you don't have a right to report it because you can't prove it. I think that's got to end.
And now, if I may, I would like to introduce a man who, between 1988 and 1995, 7 consecutive times won the most handsomest man in ufology, and of course I mean Michael Lindemann.
I didn't even know that. Do I get something for that? Can I collect on that? Okay, thank you. Thank you. We here in this room are not completely typical of the rest of the human population in at least one respect, and that is that there are a great many good and decent people out there who honestly don't think about this the way we do. They don't think about it as something that's compelling and real and urgent and even personal, as I'm sure it's personal for many in this room. There are people who are highly educated, highly intelligent, and highly informed who honestly have never given 1 minute of serious thought to this subject. Nonetheless, these people are very bright, they're very accomplished, they're very experienced in many ways. And so the question arose some years ago between me and some other people. What would it be like to bring a representative sample of those people into a room, into a set of structured seminars in which we asked them to address fresh, without warning, without preparation, what would happen if human beings came face to face with non-human intelligence, if we knew for sure, for certain, no questions, no cover-up, absolute certainty that this contact was occurring. What would that mean? How would this particular interesting group of capable people grapple with that challenge? To give you an idea of the kind of people I'm talking about a vice president of a multi-billion-dollar company, a 3-star serving general officer, academics, futurists, journalists, artistic professionals, a really interesting group of people, each and every one of them highly experienced, highly capable, highly accomplished. In fairness, I should say that several of the people in that room knew a lot about UFOs, but more than 2/3 of them professed to know nothing. And in point of fact, during the entire 2 long weekends that comprised what we came to call the contact planning sessions, we never ever talked about UFOs. Not once. What we did talk about was the possibility that humans could indeed come in contact with non-human intelligence in a whole variety of different ways. And then we asked, well, okay, if that happened, what would it mean? How would it unfold?
What would key stakeholder groups do? Stakeholder groups like the government, like religious institutions, like the scientific community. What would they do? What would it look like? And what's interesting about it is that this group that came to this question relatively fresh and relatively unpolluted, if you will, by prior UFO information, arrived at some really interesting conclusions, which I think are highly germane to what we here in this room believe is true. Most of us, I'm sure.
I introduce you a man who could have a PhD if he'd stop feeding his family and go back to school, Richard Dolan.
I have a little story to tell, and it's in a couple of different parts. The first part is what I call the history of an idea, the idea of crash retrievals. And we haven't had crash retrieval conferences since forever, have we? No. And in fact, even 30 years ago, crash retrievals were never discussed, hardly ever, in what you would call ufology. And so how have we learned what we've learned? And I want to provide an overview of that. And it's not just because I like to be a historian, but because I think by reviewing some of the impact of those original stories, things that came out due to people like Leonard Stringfield and others who came after him, have a tremendous impact. And sometimes it's easy for us to forget what those accounts were. I want to discuss that, sort of the architecture of the leaks, as it were, as they occurred through the 1970s, 80s, and 90s. What I want to do then is to argue why it's very probable that the U.S. military and very probably other militaries continue to try to shoot UFOs down. And it's my opinion that some of these have been successful. And I'll explain that why. There's certainly a long, long history of continued attempted interceptions that occurred through the 1980s and 90s and into our own century. My first book describes a lot of those attempts from the earlier years. The next book that I'm writing describes many, many of the accounts as they occurred through the last few decades. And look, I mean, if you've got military jets continuing to chase these objects, my assumption is the military people have reason to think they have a chance of getting them. And I think a couple of times they probably do. And along those lines, I've begun to question in my own mind the argument that, well, they're just so far ahead of us that we have no chance. I'm not personally convinced that that's the case every time. And I would suggest that of all of the civilizations in our galaxy right now, that ours has a pretty good chance of being the one that's in the most rapid stage of technological progress right this minute. We're going really fast, and we're headed toward another quantum jump in our capabilities. And maybe, just maybe, we're able, much better than we might have been years past, to shoot some of these things down. Just my thought. I guess my feeling is that what we're dealing with in terms of secrecy is that it is beyond government in the formal sense, in that the dominant powers of this seem to be, let's call it, behind government. And they may have their foot in various governments, but I don't think they answer to governments. So that, in a sense, we're in a position where some of the control over this has probably gone so far deep black that it may be difficult for responsible public officials to get control of it. I'm not saying they can't, but it doesn't look good.
Mike, since Stone and Sherman, meaning Dan Sherman, communicated with the EBs, indications are that EBs are here, all right, based on that statement. Therefore, the $64,000 question, where are they?
Well, the EBEs that Stone worked with were those that he telepathically interfaced with at the crash retrievals. So they were ones that were here physically and either were injured, dying, or were taken into custody. The EBEs that Dan Sherman communicated with, they were apparently part of a government extraterrestrial program whereby EBE abductions would be monitored and then reported back to this shadowy government agency who would keep track of who's been abducted, where, how long they were gone for, and what happened to them.
As far as where bases are, I guess all we have are stories, and some of them are good and some not good. But the ones that I think are good would place bases in a couple of mountain regions: Alaska, Pyrenees, Himalayas, and also in Australia, northern Australia. I consider to be the best, let's say, stories. I don't know if they're true, but I think that they could be true. I also think that there's an under-ocean base, probably not far from Puerto Rico. And I think there's probably others. But again, all you have to go on are stories by people that you think may be credible. I couldn't say in my position that I know any of those things are true. But I will say that I'll distinguish my belief from my knowledge, and I believe that there are multiple bases by people who are not human who live here.
Yeah, if you take any world atlas map of the United States, a good large one, do that. Go and look at all the western states, look at the military facilities, including California, which has vast facilities. You don't hear much about them for whatever reason. The fact is, there's enough facilities out there to have enough underground and above ground stuff to hold the Galactic World Fair, and we wouldn't even know it. This question I'm going to take myself so you don't think I'm just a pretty face. What happened to Jimmy Carter's promise for disclosure when he got in office? He didn't make a promise for disclosure. Carter made a promise that he would look into the UFO thing and try to get documents out, which is not disclosure. And he made an effort. He initiated 2 studies in the White House, one through Weber and the other through, the other on his own initiative, bringing in Marcia Schiff from the research, the Congressional Library Research, to organize it. The first study, the Weber study, was shut down immediately by the Defense Department, who came in and came down very hard on Weber, who then quit SRI and then became harassed for the next 10 years until he left the country. The other study was basically opposed by everybody in the Bush Carter administration, starting with George H.W. Bush, who basically told Jimmy to go pound sand. His NASA administrator rejected him, and you know, the idea was, you're a nuclear, physicist guy and everything else. What do you know? And what do you need to know? So eventually, what happened is, on a face-saving basis, they kind of put a little something together. Marcia Schiff wrote a final report called UFO Enigma, and it was shut down. However, in the process, part of the face-saving finish to that Carter study, the first one, they brought in a bunch of material to be reviewed, including stuff from Blue Book. They brought it in and put it in the basement of the Library of Congress. And Danny Sheehan was one of the people that went to see it, and he saw some interesting things, which he finally started talking about publicly in 2000, including a crash saucer and some things. Nick, the UK, okay? Nice place. I've never been there, but I hear it's pretty cool. The last 5-6 years, I've been reading article after article. They release this document. They release that report. They release this stuff. Then the saucer program is shut down over here. And then a report comes out that it's all swamp gas. Then more documents come out. What's going on? I mean, is the whole MOD need to be on Prozac or something? Can you sum it up? What's happening there?
Yeah, the reason why it's kind of confusing as to what goes on in England is because you have this several tier system like you have or have had over here. I'm sure most of you probably heard of Nick Pope. Nick Pope worked at the Ministry of Defence, and between 91, he's actually just resigned from the Ministry of Defence, by the way. Between 91 and 94, he investigated UFOs for one division of the MOD called Air Staff 2A. Now, Air Staff 2A, if you ask Nick Pope, by his own admission, he will admit to you that he never actually left his office to investigate a case. He never actually went out into the field, so to speak. The extent of his work basically involved, if a report came into his office, he would then share it with radar experts and people whose job it was to track satellites, and the teams would either individually or collectively get back to him and say, we know it was the ABC-123 satellite, or it was satellite debris re-entering the atmosphere, etc., etc. And then Nick would write back to Mr. Smith from London and say, "Dear Mr. Smith, we've consulted with air defence experts and we think you've seen the planet Venus," or something along those lines. Now, behind the scenes, you have independent research that was being undertaken by another division of the MOD called the Defence Intelligence Staff, which is kind of like the US Defence Intelligence Agency, and also another agency called the Provost and Security Services, which is kind of like the Air Force Office of Special Investigations. So you have several different bodies in the MOD and connected to the MOD, all doing independent research. And some of you might have heard of this Condign report that came out through the MOD just recently, in which they said everything could be explained in terms of atmospheric phenomena. Now, if you look at what's perhaps more interesting, is that the internal documentation generated concerning this report actually said this report is not to be circulated to Air Staff 2A, which was the office that Nick Pope worked in. The staff in there were never briefed on it or told that it even existed. So that's probably the reason why you have these conflicting stories about something comes from one office saying there's nothing to it. Then you have somebody like Nick saying, you know, I think it's extraterrestrial, but the MOD didn't investigate it. Then you have the Provost and Security Services doing clandestine investigations, definitely going back to the 50s. And we know that their records haven't surfaced. We've just got whistleblower testimony. So that's why we've got these conflicting weird stories where it seems one person's saying something and one's saying something else. They're just not clear to know what the other knows.
The question is, which of the alien species are involved with cattle mutilations?
There are firsthand, they think they were conscious, testimonies to watching reptilians demonstrate how they take the fluid, the excisions for food. So there's a category there. The largest category in which deputies, ranchers, and others have seen entities in pastures where animals have been mutilated or in corrals. When they see those entities, they are grays, and they almost uniformly small, not tall, which from my point of view today, if you are dealing with anything in the extraterrestrial biological entity category that is a grayish kind of skin in the black lenses or eyes, if they are shorter than 4 feet, my own personal opinion is they're programmed androids, and they're there to do work. If they're taller, I think we're in a different category of intelligence that has volition. And then the third most enigmatic possible category has to do with the blonde humanoids. And there was a remarkable story that took place in the Midwest in the 70s in which the rancher came upon the blondes with an animal down in the pasture. And it was a mutilation. So that's all of the three major groups, one of which has communicated telepathically in the abduction syndrome, that's the reptilians, that they're doing this for food. The others, the suggestion is, especially in the Ebens, which they're the most common, they've got some kind of a survival issue and it's a genetic harvest. And is it entirely their survival issue? And if it is, why are they using the surface life of the Earth? And then you get into those complicated questions of time travel. And the blondes, to me, are the most enigmatic of all. And that, today, it's as confusing and complex, and I really have never, ever talked with anybody in military and intelligence, and when I ask them straight out, do you really know fundamentally what is the application of centuries, perhaps, thousands and thousands of animals, wild and domestic? What is it? It seems like a trade in product, as opposed to just a genetic harvest or food. But those are the only two categories I know.
It's been my experience that after being visited by ETs, it's been my experience, I wonder if that's just a phrase or literally, that they make it very difficult for you to talk about it with others, almost like you have been programmed not to talk about it. Is this common, or What do you think?
I think there are many reasons why a person doesn't talk about something like this, and part of it may be that they are indeed controlled or dissuaded by the interaction itself or the beings involved. But society imposes some pretty stiff penalties for talking about this. There are lots of disincentives for not talking about this. And I don't think that any human being is necessarily completely conscious of all the ways in which they are manipulated by societal norms or societal expectations, or just the subliminal fear they might be dropped off someone's Christmas list. There are lots of reasons we don't talk. And I think that when you're dealing with something as extraordinary and out of the box as a contact with a non-human intelligence, it's very hard to judge what the exact reason is for reticence. But I think we can guess at any number of reasons, and that together those reasons are extremely compelling. And perhaps what's more remarkable is how many people do talk, and how much courage it takes to do it. If you're one of the people in the room who's sitting on something really big and you've never talked, you're in good company. There's lots of people just like you, but there's it may be liberating for you to talk. And I don't want to pile a lot of work on my wife Deborah, but I know that she's talked to an awful lot of people, and she's a good person to talk to. But there are other good people to talk to as well. Some of them are sitting here at this table. It's always a big jump to talk for the first time, but it may be a good thing to do.
Yes, Matthew, please jump in.
I mentioned a little bit earlier that I'm not primarily a researcher. I'm a facilitator, and I've been hosting group meetings up in Bellingham, Washington for about 18 years now. Primarily our focus is on UFOs, near-death experiences, that sort of thing. And these are public meetings, which anybody can come to. But in addition, we started up a support group meeting that meets in conjunction with the public meetings, confidential and very tight-knit group. So I've had a lot of dealings with folks who have had encounter experiences, and the one thing I can say that is common to them all is that they're very traumatic experiences. They're life-changing. So I think part of the reason that people don't come forward and speak about these things is there is an element, apart from the social stigma that can be attached to it, unfortunately, shouldn't be there, but is a level of personal conflict. These kinds of phenomena, these experiences, change your entire perspective of what's real, what's important to you, what your life means. And it's very difficult to come forward, even to yourself, to admit that these things have happened, and to try and come forward with a way in which to approach it so that you can deal with it within your own context, much less come forward with it to somebody else. So it's very traumatic, and people are very reticent to talk about these things, except in a closed, confidential kind of atmosphere.
I just want to muddy things up for a moment and point out that within the U.S. military there are so-called non-lethal weapons technologies that are able to get inside your head, transform your emotions, induce panic, all kinds of things. These are very classified. They exist. One thing that I've noticed is that frequently when people experience a UFO sighting, a craft goes over them, frequently what you find is that they react in ways that they themselves don't understand when they look back. They'll think, why was I so calm? Why was I almost sedated? Or why did I have such unbelievably intense panic? Or whatever. It's my own opinion that in all likelihood there are either intentionally or inadvertently wavelengths, EM wavelengths that come out that somehow affect us. And I also think it would be possible if our military is able to tweak your emotions in various ways if they need to. I would think that they could also, but I don't really know if that's the case.
Only anecdotal. I have never been able to get a coroner's report. Worked with John Altshuler before he died 3 years ago on several cases where we would get a phone call. One was in Missouri about 7 years ago, and it was supposed to be a man that was found lying face down, nude, with the classic excisions. And we thought that John Altshuler with CU Med and all of his huge medical background would be able to call the coroner's office and totally classified. And that case was shut tighter than a drum, which again doesn't prove anything. Okay, so there's anecdotal stories like that with absolutely no proof. And that Thomas C. case in Pennsylvania is extremely strange because there were anecdotal stories that when he was found in his undershorts that they found, if you guys don't know Thomas C., it's a man who disappeared, and there were people reported UFOs, and then he was found within, I think it was only 40 feet of his house, and everybody had been looking for 5 days. So it was like he's suddenly put back and he's dead and had only on undershorts, and the scuttlebutt inside the town, because I was dealing with a man who did detective work for an insurance company, and he said that privately he didn't see the photos, but he was told that law enforcement had, and the FBI had photos, that there had been excisions from the, I believe, the rectal and the penile area. Now, again, there's nothing to document this. And if I may, because I think this is really important, going back to '91, I believe, at one of the Laughlin conferences, there was a person from Brazil who presented some photographs, or a couple of photographs, of a man who had black around jaw flesh. There was a hole in his abdomen. There was a hole slightly around the rectum. It actually wasn't a hole. It was more the flesh had been eaten away, and it was black. And the person who presented those photos at that Laughlin conference said, and this is a mutilation of a human like the animal mutilations that Linda Moulton Howe researches. And this person had never contacted me, and there was no link whatsoever. Well, I got the photos, and I took them to a medical doctor in Philadelphia, somebody that I knew. I did not front load the conversation at all. I had simply said, could I show you some photographs and just give me your medical assessment just based on the photographs? And why this is worth telling is as soon as I laid those photographs from Brazil down in front of a medical doctor, he said, oh, I saw a lot of that in Vietnam. And I said, what did you see in Vietnam? He said, that's what Agent Orange does to human flesh. It burrows in and leaves a black ring. This is nothing like animal mutilations. There's no connection, no link, and yet that was being presented at a conference as if it were. So I hope for any of you who were ever exposed to that Brazil presentation that you will know that that had nothing to do with the animal mutilation phenomenon, and I don't have any evidence that humans have been involved.
Yeah, there's a lot of potential speculation about what places ought to be involved in reverse engineering, and there's a long list of people, you know, Monsanto and Rand and 3M and DuPont and General Electric, and all these people are probably do classified projects, and they probably have, subtle projects, and you have to decide, is it going to stay in the military security world with this advanced ET technology, or are we going to leak part of it out into the civilian world, or to potential patents? The Majestic documents to only talk about one potential item, and that's fiber optics in 47, glass-like fibers with a cladding wrap, and that's the key breakthrough in fiber optics. And it's mentioned in 47 in a document, and it's patented in 53. And through a government contract activity. So the notion of reverse engineering is very real, and it's somebody's great book in the future. A lot of research has to be done, but I think, there's a lot of corporations that have been knowingly or most likely unknowingly participating.
All right, folks, it has been a great evening. I really appreciate your coming. Thanks so much. And a round for our speakers, our panel. Good night.